me, even though I wasn't pursuing him at the time. He was watching out for me. He was drawing up a plan for my life, before I had a hair on my head. And that's really the thing that I want people to understand when they hear my story, is that I'm no chosen one. I'm nobody special. I grew up in a little bitty town, less than 1,000 people. But my parents used to pray and pray and pray. And I know that there were days in their lives when they thought God's not listening. And here's the thing, God's always listening. We live in a society where we want to pray and then we want to see the results happen immediately. It doesn't work like that sometimes, God's timing is perfect. His plans are always better than our plans. I look out every night and I see mom and dads and grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles, and then I see a lot of us who wouldn't be here had it not been for those prayers from our mom and dads and our grandmas and grandpas and our aunts and uncles. Like that one prayer that you prayed that you knew, like, man, if God can just hear this prayer, it could change the course of their entire life, I'm a result of that. I'm just a result of a family's constant prayer and faith and just believing and trusting in God. And I didn't grow up wanting to play music. I should have retired from the NBA already, That's what I thought anyway. I wanted to play basketball in college. I wanted to play in the NBA one day. And I grew up in church. My dad was a worship leader. My mom sang at church. Somewhere along the way, I lost track of all of that. I forgot. I got in the wrong crowd. I started using drugs and alcohol. In my senior year of high school, I lost 2 Division I basketball scholarships. I got in trouble for drug use. I ended up dropping out of high school at Christmas break in my senior year, and I got my GED. And my dad owned a construction company, and I went to work for him. And I just remember thinking, my life is over. Everything that I've dreamed of becoming is gone. In just an instant. And I didn't have anybody to blame for that, I tried to, but I didn't. It was my own fault. I had an amazing family, community, support system. A year later, I walked on to a junior college and I made the team and I got a full scholarship, and then I moved 4 hours away from home, and I still hadn't learned my lesson. As soon as I get to college and the party starts, I'm like, hey, I want to be the best at the party. So unfortunately, that was just who I was. I was just, if there was something I wanted to be better at it than anybody else, and I wanted to drink more, party more, do more than anybody. And the day before my freshman season started, I tore all the ligaments in my ankle in practice one day. And I thought my life was over again, I didn't have I wasn't traveling a lot with the team. I had all this free time on my hand, and I remember I picked up my roommate's guitar, and first time I held it in my hands, I thought, this is exactly what I want to do for the rest of my life. And there'd been a guitar in my house growing up as a kid, my whole life. And I remember watching my dad play it, and I saw music stands, but I didn't have any interest in it. And all of a sudden, I'm holding this guitar, and I'm like, this is what I want to do. And I start thinking about it, and I'm like, I like to party quite a bit. If I can get good enough at the guitar, I can be a rock star. And that's what I thought. I thought, to play music and to travel the world, you lived in excess, And I was cocky, and I was full of myself, and I wasn't a good person. And I carried that into my marriage. I carried it into being a husband and a father and a son and friends. And I remember I was working with my dad when I came back from college and playing music. He was watching me struggle all the time, and going through this life that I'd created for myself that I thought was awesome at the time. Everybody else around me thought it was awesome. My wife could see I was maybe the saddest person in the world, she used to say. Everybody thinks you're so happy, she said, but you got to be one of the saddest people I know, And that was it, because I knew better. I'd been raised to know better. I was carrying around this guilt and shame, and I was trying to cover it up with drugs and alcohol. My dad, he used to say, Zach, I don't have an answer for you. other than Jesus. And I knew it, but I didn't want to hear it at the time. And in 2012, I was getting ready to leave for Europe for a month. And my wife came to me and she said, hey, we can't keep doing this, you know. You're gonna kill yourself. Like, I don't want to be around for that, you know. And if you can't make some changes for your family, we're out. I didn't want to watch, you know, I didn't want to watch my wife and kids leave. I wanted to change, but I couldn't. And I remember just thinking about Jesus, you know, this Jesus that my parents had raised me to know. I said, God, if you're real, prove it. You know, if you can prove it to me, then I'll leave all this stuff behind. I'll leave this rock star thing behind, and I'll follow you. I'll leave for the tour. About a week into the tour, I was reading a book. We were driving across Spain, and I had headphones on. I was reading this book, and I shut the book, and I take my headphones off, and I'm looking out the window of the bus, and this guy's scanning radio stations up in the front, and out of nowhere I hear Redeemed by Big Daddy Weave come across the radio. And I was like, okay, this is weird. We're in Europe, like they're not playing this kind of music. And I knew it was God, you know. I was like, okay, God, I hear you. But what I heard in that song was that God sees me in a way that I'll never see myself. He sees us all in a way we'll never see ourselves. Same way that my wife and my mom and dad and my children were seeing me. And I realized in that moment, man, I've missed it. Like, I grew up in church, but I had this idea or this view of who I thought God was, and I thought I thought he just sat on his throne all day with his arms crossed, you know, shaking his head at everything I did wrong. And it's not it at all. Like, he loved me so much that he sent his son to die for me, you know, so that I wouldn't have to go through all this junk. And had it just been for me or for any one of you, he would have gone to the cross and bled for us, you know. And I called Crystal and I said, hey, you're not gonna believe this, but I'm done. When I get home, I'm done. And she was like, well, you didn't sound done 2 nights ago, you know. I was like, well, I'm done, you know. And I remember coming home, and like I said, I walked in our house, got on my hands and knees. I gave my life to the Lord on June 10th of 2012, and we've never looked back. I remember when we were trying to find a church to go to, we'd gotten invited to go to this church in our hometown, and I mean, I knew about the church, you know, it's this big white Southern Baptist church. Everybody called it Six Flags Over Jesus, and I was like, I'm not going there, you know. At the time, I had hair down to about the middle of my chest here, and I was wearing bell bottoms. I looked like a hippie, and I was like, I'm not going there. And I went there. And man, I just remember people loving on us, you know. It was exactly what we needed. I mean, I remember feeling like this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. And about 6 months into it, worship pastor says, hey, will you sing a song on Sunday? And I was like, I don't know. I sang a song called Redeemed by Big Daddy Weave, first time ever at church. And about 6 months later, the head pastor of the church comes to me and he's like, hey, we've been watching you and your family, and God's been doing an amazing work in your life. And we've wanted to launch a campus here for several years. We've just not had the right guy, and we want to launch a campus called The Refuge. So we want to reach out to people who've, you know, maybe walked away from church at some point, or never really found their place, or maybe they were offended or felt like they just didn't fit in. And at the time, there was a large Celebrate Recovery group that was a part of our church, and there was a big biker church, you know. There was a biker church, there was a cowboy church. I mean, it was like all these groups that like just really didn't have their spot yet, you know. When we start this service, he says, hey, will you come to work for us? And I was like, man, I'm not a worship leader. He was like, no kidding. He said, but we feel like God put you here, you know. He put you here for a reason. And me and my wife prayed about it, and I took a part-time job working at the church. I started meeting all these people that were coming to the service, and they were telling me their stories, and I realized really quick that, man, we've all got a lot of the same stories, you know. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, you know, especially at church. But that's where you're supposed to talk about it, you know. And the one thing I realized that everybody here has in common is we all need Jesus Christ in our life. Like, he's the only one that can fix us, just like my dad said. So I started writing songs for church, the congregation. I started sharing my story, me and my wife. Services, they start growing, and next thing I know, we're doing 2 services, and every once in a while I'm getting to go into the other services and lead, and I start doing college ministry, and before long, I get invited to Nashville to write some music, and I start taking trips back and forth to Nashville. I ended up writing a song called Chainbreaker, and I remember coming back and playing that song for my dad, and I was still working, you know, at the church. I was still helping my dad some, and I remember we were on a job site one day. You know, my dad, he said, I got to tell you a story. He said, you know, when I was like, okay. He said, I've never told you this before. Let me just set this thing up for you. It's Arkansas, much like Tennessee. It's about 100 degrees in the summer. It's pretty hot. We got a lot more mosquitoes than you guys have, but we go out into this garage where we're working to have lunch, and there's a stack of sheetrock in the garage, and my main course was Viennese sausages. Y'all ever had those? So my band makes fun of me for saying Viennese sausages. How do you guys? Is it Vienna or Viennese? I heard Viennese. See you guys? Well, it was Viennese sausages, Mountain Dew, a bag of Funyuns. This will even, that's what I'm talking about. This will even further along how redneck I am. I didn't have a fork, so I had a 16-penny nail that I was getting those things out. Me and my dad were sitting on this job site. He said, you know, he said, when I met your mother in high school, we started dating. We got married right out of high school. We were young, you know, and he said, we started running around partying with our friends. He said, your mom never really liked to party. He said, I like to party. He said, then we started talking about a family, but I wasn't ready to slow down the party yet. He said, and me and your mother separated for like 6 months. And he said, while we were separated, he said, I found Jesus, and he brought me and your mom back together. And he said, you and your sister wouldn't be here today had it not been for the Lord. And he said, we made a promise that we would raise our children in church. And he said, so we decided we should probably move away from a lot of the folks that we've been running around with and start a new life. My dad wanted to go to Bible college, so they moved to Pensacola, Florida, and started going to a Bible college down there. And a couple years later, I was born, and Dad said, we were going to this church, and we decided to have you dedicated as a baby. He said, we're walking down to the front of the church that morning. He said, you start screaming and hollering, you're crying, carrying on. He said, the pastor just said, man, it sounds like Zach's got a strong set of lungs. He'll probably be a singer one day. And everybody started laughing, and Mom and Dad got quiet, and he said, the pastor got really serious. And he looked at him and he said, this child will be a voice for his generation. And I was just in tears. And I look at my dad and I'm like, Dad, I'm 30-something years, like 33 years old. I said, why? Have you never shared this story? He said, well, I didn't want to put any pressure on you. He said, I used to think about it all the time when you were growing up. He said, you never showed any interest in music. He said, I played music. There was a guitar in the house. He said, you never had an interest. And I thought, what did he mean by that? You know, he said, but you were always a leader, you know, even when you were young. He said, then in college, you came home your first year of college, and you came home and you said, hey, I'm going to take one of your guitars back to school and teach myself how to play it. He said, I thought, well, you don't pick up a guitar at 20 years old and start playing music. And he said, then you came home a year later and you were writing songs, and they were pretty good. And he said, a few years later, you started playing music in this rock band, and you started living this lifestyle that me and your mother hadn't raised you to live. And he said, we just had to watch you struggle through that, you know. My mom and dad, they used to come sit at these shows for hours on end, you know, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. While I got just absolutely hammered on stage every night playing in these bar gigs, they'd sit out there and drink coffee and pray for me. They'd make sure that I could get home okay after the show, or they'd come over to my house and they'd pray for me and my wife. Dad said we used to sit out there and we would just pray and trust God that one day He would take all of this stuff that's going on in your life and He would use it for His glory. He said, I'm not telling you now to put pressure on you. He said, I'm telling you now because He said, I feel like the Lord's giving you a gift and He's giving you an opportunity to write music and to share your story through songs that can help other people, recover from things that are going on in their own lives. He said He's giving you a platform now to speak from, to share with what He can do with anybody, with the world. And I don't tell it to you guys to brag about it, because if I'm being honest, I'm not worthy. Like, I am so messed up. I'm so more messed up than I am fixed. And I get it so much more wrong than I get it right. But God's been using messed up people to do His work for a really long time. He just wants to hear you say yes. You know what I mean? My favorite Bible verse has always been Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, to prosper you, not to harm you, for hope in the future. This song's called Plan for Me.